I'm late to the party, but apparently 8 years ago, this absolute banger of a game dropped, and I was, busy. It feels kind of weird to experience such an amazing game 8 years after everyone else probably had a very similar experience. Dark Souls 3 is one of those experiences that almost leaves you feeling upset at how good it was after a little bit, because you just know that you're never going to experience that same joy that you had with your first playthrough ever again. Over the last few years, I started playing all of the FromSoft Souls games in order of release, and I am pumped to finally be making the video on Dark Souls 3. I've played every game up until this point, including Demon Souls and Bloodborne, employing a very similar strategy, so let me catch you up. I don't look up anything prior. I truly do play these games blind, except I look up missable bosses after missing the Dark Lurker in Dark Souls 2, so thanks for that feedback, my guys. I never summon for help on the bosses, not even once. I basically never restore my humanity. I just play these games as a hollow and find the Ring of Binding, which I'm just now realizing I never found the Ring of Binding in Dark Souls 3. I use a dex build, and I typically try a few different weapons throughout a playthrough. It's just how I started these series, and I just kind of want to keep it somewhat consistent from game to game. I do my best to complete 100% of the content that I can in the game, but you know FromSoft, I definitely miss some questline bullshit like in every game. That's pretty much it. I actually didn't use armor for most of Dark Souls 3, but that was more because I just liked having the longer rolls and the iframes as I get better and better at these games. Some of you may remember old Tittles from Dark Souls 2, and I have fantastic news. Tittles is transitioning from a lowercase L to a lowercase I, and I present to you titties. Anyways, here's my 8-year-old late blind review of Dark Souls 3. Usually, I've begun my Souls review talking about what's changed and improved from title to title. In this case, I feel like I can kind of use Dark Souls 2 and Bloodborne to compare to Dark Souls 3 because, well, it's all FromSoft and they're similar enough. But before I get to the game-to-game improvements and changes, I just want to give my straight-up first impressions of Dark Souls 3 because for the first time ever, I actually took some first impressions notes because I wasn't being a gigantic, lazy piece of shit. Dark Souls 3, as soon as I booted this thing up, my sweat glands started instantly releasing fluid and my ears started gasming, and well, what I'm trying to say is that I really like this opening menu song, and it really set the mood to just get me into my Dark Souls vibe after playing Bloodborne for the last little bit. After blasting menu music for a few minutes and making my character, my first in-game impressions were also very positive. For one, Dark Souls 3 just feels smooth. I thought Bloodborne felt smooth too, and that game is locked to 30 FPS. I think that more had to do with the PS3 to PS4 console jump as to why Bloodborne felt so much better than Dark Souls 2. By comparison, Dark Souls 2 feels like you're playing underwater. Or one of those dreams where you try to throw a punch, but you physically can't in your dream. It's like, oh, I'm gonna get you, dude! Oh! And then you just never get there, and you wake up in a pure sweat, and there's piss everywhere. No. There isn't piss. I'm sorry. I didn't notice that while I was playing Dark Souls 2, but as soon as I had 12 seconds into Bloodborne, I was like, man, that game is slow. Dark Souls 3 feels even smoother than Bloodborne, and I'm sure that's because it jumps from 30 to 60 FPS. Bloodborne in 60 FPS is an experience I would like to have in my life before I perish. If that's all right. The main thing that really stuck out to me in my first few minutes of gameplay in Dark Souls 3 was just how sharp everything looked. The UI, the menus, all that shit just looked like a game that was made in this decade. I never really noticed it in Dark Souls 1 and 2 until now, but their menus look and feel like a 2000s game, and I feel like Dark Souls 3 fixed that and kind of sharpened everything up a little bit. The graphics obviously look better, but personally, I don't really care about that. I think art direction is much more important, especially nowadays when graphical improvements are so minor. There's plenty of areas in Dark Souls 1 and 2, even though the game is over 10 years old, that look really nice. To wrap up my quick first impressions here, I gotta say I was absolutely shocked when I walked into the first area and it was called Firelink Shrine. I was like, oh, we're doing that? We're going on the nostalgia trip? All right, I'm ready. I gotta say, I'm just absolutely terrible at understanding of what's going on lore-wise, but from what I can tell, it kind of seems like we're on the same map. We're in Lordran, just way in the future. I did wait to Google all that until after beating the game in case there was some sort of explanation to the first game. However, if there was, I definitely missed it. Before you ever get to Firelink Shrine, though, you have to face off against your first boss in the game, Old Gunder. And I gotta say, dude, Gunder's music, that might be some of the best music in gaming, period. Oh my god. This boss, it was so good. Dark Souls always has good music, but I knew between the opening menu music and this boss music that this was about to be on another level. The first area just set the whole mood and the vibe of the game perfectly. By the time I walked into Firelink Shrine, I was ready to sink 3 straight days into this game, just staying up all night, but, you know, I'm old, and after like 9 hours of screen time, my eyes begin to bleed now. So that settles my first impressions. I don't think I could have been more impressed with this game in the first 30 minutes of gameplay, but let's go ahead and get into the first actual topic of the overall game and review now, starting with the quality of life and changes between titles. Outside of stuff I already mentioned in the intro, like 60 FPS and the UI feeling better, there were a few differences that I noticed from Dark Souls 2 and 3. One of the first things I noticed is that humanity has been replaced with embers now. Now, in general, I've been using like 2 or 3 humanities per game. It's not my jam. I usually just stay hollow. I'd use them if, like, especially in Dark Souls 1, if I was really struggling with the boss and I was like, man, maybe that extra HP is what I need to beat it. It never is. It's always just getting good. But yeah, that's like the only time I would ever use humanity. But they've been replaced with embers in this game. The items are largely useless to me, but I think in general it's a pretty good change that you can't just spam humanities to get full health over and over and over and over, and that you can just pop embers once until you die. I think that that's a pretty solid balancing change, especially because of how OP Estus is in this game, but I'll talk about that later. Embers absolutely are the cooler item. The first time I killed Gunder and I got embered and I had like the burning ash stuff falling off of my guy, my girl, my character, my, you know, whatever, I was like, wow, that is so cool. One thing that's a huge quality of life thing for me, I think, is how they handled torches in Dark Souls 3 compared to Dark Souls 2. I gotta say, man, if old Tittles could see me now, he'd be so disappointed. I took pride in not lighting a single damn torch in the entirety of the gutter. We were in the dark, okay? I was working only off of echolactation, like a bat. I very much planned on also not using a torch in Dark Souls 3, because why should I? But as soon as I encountered one of those maggot monsters, gotta be careful with that one, I was getting very frustrated with the bleed damage, only to realize I in fact did need a torch in order to easily remove the leeches or maggots or whatever they are. So yeah, I did use a torch in this game, but it was really only just to remove the bleed status ailment thing. Regardless, moving back to the Bloodborne, and I believe it was how Dark Souls 1 handled torches much better. I'd much rather just have like a offhand weapon that you equip as a torch rather than like this timer, add 5 minutes to your torch counter every time you find one. That was so stupid. Why'd they do that? That was literally just an excuse to put more white orbs on the map so that you have more stuff to find as you're exploring. I'm almost positive. Speaking of finding fun little white orbs, let's transition to just talking about the whole world of Dark Souls 3 as a whole. The world of these FromSoft games, put simply, is the reason I love these games so much. When I began playing these games, I fell in love with the fact that I simply was not good enough to beat this game, which felt blasphemous to me. You're telling me there's no difficulty setting and I'm not good enough? Yeah, right, dude. Now, if a game has a difficulty setting called "this difficulty setting will melt your fucking face into Play-Doh," then I don't feel so bad when I can't beat it. Because, like, I play games competitively, I have fun playing hard games, but, like, if you intentionally make your game so that you have to, like, put hundreds of hours into it just to beat it on a difficulty setting, that doesn't do it for me. But having no difficulty selector and it's that difficult, that really intrigued me. And obviously, many others as well. While that was the draw that got me into playing these Souls games for the first time, by the time I started playing Bloodborne, I realized I had run into an issue. I had gotten too good at these games to actually get enjoyment from only the difficulty. But still, I found myself playing through Bloodborne and loving it for the many other reasons that people love these games. Now, that didn't stop me from making an absolutely ridiculously clickbait title and thumbnail and just getting bent the fuck over by the comments section last video because I called the precious little game too easy. But genuinely, if you actually listen to what I said in the video, I loved the world of Bloodborne. I love the creepy old English aesthetic that they put me in so much that I didn't really care that I didn't find the game all that challenging on my first playthrough. I've heard a lot of people say that the world of Bloodborne is their favorite world in any video game ever, and I get it. After I played it, I really loved it too, but I do kind of like the vibes of the Dark Souls worlds just a little better, if I'm being honest. I just really like the whole knights with swords and shields and demons and castles. I like that vibe a lot better than like the horror, alien, zombie, whatever the fuck was going on in Bloodborne. All that being said on the importance of world building in these FromSoft games, this world, the world of Dark Souls 3, is probably my favorite world in any video game that I've ever played. Before this, Souls-wise, I would have told you that Dark Souls 1 was my favorite world for many reasons, but something I've talked about in the past a lot is circular progression. I think in general, games that aren't open world follow a linear progression kind of deal where you walk around in an area with a start point and a finish point, and then you advance into a new area, and that's that. FromSoft, outside of Dark Souls 2, when I made this beautiful paint graphic to explain linear versus circular progression, makes the absolute best worlds to play in due to the circular progression. Some things that make Dark Souls world exploring and progression feel so good are very small things you likely don't even notice on a first playthrough. At least I didn't. Like, I knew it was happening, but I didn't know why. I didn't know why I loved the world I was in so much. You know how you discover a new area in a Dark Souls game and you'll see an item orb like way off in the distance somewhere, floating up high, and you're like, how the hell am I supposed to get that thing? And you explore the whole area, you go all around the item, but you cannot find a way to it. And eventually you just give up and keep going through the level. 95% of the time in a Souls game, if you can't figure out how to get an item quickly, that's intentional by the developers. As everyone who's watching these videos knows, if you just keep progressing through the area, they will find a way for you to get to that ledge that that item was on that you thought you couldn't get to in a way that you had no idea that was even possible. You'll have felt like you spent 30 minutes climbing through some castle or through some cave system or whatever, and then you pop back out in the area you started, smack some ladder down or get some elevator going again, and all of a sudden you're in a spot where you can get that item that you once deemed impossible to get. That really wraps things together for me, and that really makes your world feel alive. That little dopamine hit you get when you finally stumble back upon that item you've been trying to get is a great example of a really small thing that does a lot for your world building. Often in linear games, once you're done with an area, you're done with it. But Dark Souls 3 was so damn good at always tying the map back together once you were done exploring an area. Dark Souls 3 has taken this concept of circular progression that I'm sure they didn't invent, or maybe they did, I don't know. But I do know that these are the first games that really made me realize that an open world doesn't necessarily mean that the world is going to be more alive or explorative. All that being said about FromSoft's world building, this world right here, Dark Souls 3, Lordran, is my favorite world ever built in a video game ever. When I got to the Undead Settlement for the first time, I felt like I was basically in an open world game. There were so many paths I could choose, all leading back to the same central area with the hollows gathered around the bonfire or whatever the heck they're doing. It felt like it took me 5 hours or so to do all the content in the Undead Settlement between the second and third bosses, and not for a second during that time did I feel like I wasn't enjoying myself. Speaking of different paths, I also like that this game basically let you decide what bosses to kill and what order at certain parts in the game. For example, after the curse-wadded Ballsack Man, I feel like the world really opened up and let me kind of explore down multiple different routes, and there was no correct order to handle the next bunch of bosses. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure you could do Crystal Sage Wolnir, Abyss Watchers, Deacons of the Deep, and the Old Demon King in almost whatever order you want. That might not be fully accurate, but it's close at least. Giving that level of exploration in your non-open world games does make the world feel like it might as well be open. I don't think there was one single part of the game where I wasn't fully immersed in this world, and for that reason, it stands out as my current favorite world in video games. Speaking of being fully immersed, I have real, actual hatred and rage brewing for whomever designs the poison and swamp areas of these fucking games. It's like they gather my and everyone's collective tears into the FromSoft Poisonometer and just they use those tears to power their next poison swamp area to be so much more worse and annoying. Farron's Keep is definitely my least favorite poison area I've ever dealt with in a Souls game. For all the positive I love about this world, man did I hate Farron's Keep. Constantly having to just spam rolls because the swamp is too thick, poison carrying items being useless because you're just going to be poisoned again in 1 second, literally adding curse frogs into the swamp so we're dealing with double status ailments at some points. Like, come on, dude. There is such a 0% chance that the developers are like, oh man, our players are just they're gonna love Farron's Keep when they're designing it. There's just no way. But I do think, as awful as it is, it kind of does help the world building a little bit, and that's why I think they keep these shit areas in the game. Think about your real life world that you're in right now. There's sick parts of your life that you really like probably like sitting on your big old ass watching this YouTube video right now. Appreciate you. And then there's parts of your world that suck, like having to go to work or having to participate in your local dung pie tossing festival. What is India doing, dude? What are they doing? Anyways, the poison areas of Dark Souls suck. And I think Dark Souls 3 had more annoying areas than any of the previous games. Honestly, I can think of 3 different poison swamps between the base game and the DLC. Poison, I feel like, was made a little bit weaker, but then you have to deal with toxic sometimes anyway later in the game. So yeah, pros and cons, I guess. Another few cool things that I do want to mention that stuck out to me in this game about the world building were the absolute scale of some of the maps, as well as the scale of some of the enemies. Anybody who's played through Dark Souls 3 now probably knows these poop giant guys. They beat the shit out of you basically the entire time that you're exploring through the Cathedral of the Deep. These poop giants terrified me as I was going through because, I mean, just look how fucking massive they are. I didn't think I would stand a chance against them at this point in the game, and clearly they were in my way of progression. The entire time I was exploring this area, I was clenching my butthole so tight as I sprinted through the areas with all the giants, just praying they didn't one-tap my ass. At the end of the day, the giants weren't actually that hard to beat, but just being on such a giant, tall map with such a giant, big enemy was enough to legit terrify my ass for like the hour I was running through that area. I like that we were made aware that we were in the same world as Dark Souls 1, the world being Mordrin or whatever, and they actually had some Easter eggs to prove it. There were some areas of the game that you could tell are past areas of Dark Souls 1 in the future, or at least they felt really familiar. I definitely wasn't great at recognizing that at the time, but I've since learned after finishing my playthrough. 2 Easter eggs that I did notice, though, were the Stray Demon mini-boss that you can find at the top of Farron's Keep, and of course the... I guess this isn't really an Easter egg, it's pretty freaking obvious, the rediscovery of Anne Orlando. Not gonna lie, I was actually getting Anne Orlando vibes from the previous area I was in, the Ithral Boreal Valley or whatever the... Yeah, the archers were shooting my dumbass off the ledge repeatedly, and I was getting some legit Anne Orlando PTSD. I got stuck on those runways in Dark Souls 1 for a very long time. And then it happened. The next area I unlocked, sure enough, was actually Anne Orlando. Not gonna lie, I was so excited to see what kind of fucked up version of Ornstein and Smo they cooked up for me to beat. And I was a little disappointed when it didn't happen. Revisiting the area was super cool, though, until I found the giant dead blacksmith, and I did not take it well. Oh, no, dude, what the fuck? No! No! The sound design of Dark Souls 3 is far and away the best of the Souls series as well. Not only is the music just absolutely next level, but like just the first boss fight music is absolutely, it gave me goosebumps, and it just, as you go through the game, it gets better and better, and it's... They also use the same new sound area from Dark Souls 1 and 2, giving it that same sort of nostalgic feel right out of the jump. They use the same elevator noises, and just little continuity of the same sound effects through game to game makes it feel like I'm playing a true sequel when there's actually not a lot of directness about shit in these games. What am I even doing again? Just killing shit for the fire gods or something? Alright. Talking about the worlds of these Dark Souls games, I do think is kind of the most important part, but my bad, this section is running so long. There's just one last thing I need to touch on, and that's the quest lines in Dark Souls 3. For the first time ever, I felt like I did a pretty decent job on the quest lines. I want to talk about 2 of them that really stuck out to me. I'm sure there was more, and I may have missed them or forgotten about them or whatever, but the Henri questline was great. Meeting them in Horse the first few times was nice, but then when Horse goes missing, I was actually invested in helping old Henri find his homie. I did find Henri at both the catacombs and the church, but I must have done something out of order. I think I took too long to find the Smoldering Lake area where you actually stumble upon Horus. I'm assuming because I exhausted Henri's dialogue options prior to finding him, I ruined that questline, but still, I kind of understand what was going to happen. It wasn't going to end well. I'm assuming by doing that, I probably missed out on a gesture or an item or for not doing something in the correct order, but nonetheless, the quest was a nice little touch to the world building. The other quest, which was my favorite questline in any Souls game I've ever played so far, was the Patches questline in this game. When you are finally at the point where 20k souls doesn't feel like an absolute robbery and you buy that lift key on the side of Firelink Shrine, you get tricked by none other than old Patches. Now, of course, we all fucking hate Patches' guts, but in this game, I felt like I got proper revenge on that bitch. The guy tries to be all kind and ask for your forgiveness once you find him vending at Firelink Shrine, but when you check his inventory, you realize something much more sinister has been going on. He killed the fucking Onion Man! Or at least, I think he did. And for that, we need no judge or jury. I just murdered him right there in cold blood and brought his shitty little ashes to the vendor in Firelink who made a joke about how I literally just murdered someone for them. Oops. Okay, I've talked way too much about the world of Dark Souls 3 to this point. It's amazing, it's beautiful, and like I said, hands down, my favorite world, not only in FromSoft games, but in any game, period. Fair and keep and all. Let's talk about the weapons in Dark Souls 3. One of my biggest complaints with Bloodborne was the lack of weapon choice compared to the Dark Souls games. A few commenters in the last video did point out that the weapons are like trick weapons and have multiple forms, so it's like one weapon is actually multiple, and I totally get that. I think I'm correct in saying there's still way more options in Dark Souls. In Dark Souls 3, by the halfway point of the game, I must have had 40 different weapon choices just chilling in my inventory. I didn't go out of my way to buy them from vendors, hunt specific weapons, or make all the boss weapons. I don't even think I made a single boss weapon. I just had that organically by playing the game. Just seeing all the weapon options in my inventory has me so excited to try a new build on my second playthrough of these games. I'm not gonna lie, I am getting a little burned out on the Dex only builds, but I feel like I'm just gonna tough it through. I only have to play Elden Ring with a Dex build now because I don't think Sekiro has stats like that, or maybe it does. I don't know. So at worst, 2 games left. I really don't know anything about Sekiro, but I'm excited to play it next. Anyhow, for my Dex build, I started with the Twin Blade Cell Swords, or the Wind Blades as I've seen them called, but I actually wasn't super fond of them. And as soon as I beat the guy to the left of Firelink Shrine, I swapped them out for the Uchigatana. I'm not gonna lie, even though I shit on Bloodborne for not having great weapon variety, I did kind of use the Uchigatana for most of my playthrough. Oops. I totally should have just lied and said I used a bunch of different weapons. I didn't really get to use a katana at all in Dark Souls 2, but I actually did use the Uchigatana for a lot of Dark Souls 1, and I played that like 4 years ago at this point or something, so it was kind of fun to use it again now that I'm so much better at the game. I did end up using the Great Scythe for a bit of the game as well, but I'm going to talk more about that in the DLC section of this video later on. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to replaying this game eventually with a cool boss weapon or something, just definitely something that's a non-Dex build. That's all I really have for the weapon variety, so let's move on to my favorite parts of these games, the bosses and the game's overall difficulty. I'll keep this short and sweet because you probably hear me say this like 3 separate times now. I love difficult video games. I fell in love with Dark Souls originally because of the difficulty. When I reviewed Bloodborne last month and Dark Souls 2 the month before that, a common complaint that I had about these 2 games is that the bosses were just too easy for me now. They were so much easier than Dark Souls 1 and Demon Souls. I don't think that's a popular opinion, and I'm willing to concede that I was wrong. Those games are probably just as difficult, if not harder, than the games before them. I've gotten pretty damn good at these games with my particular playstyle now with a couple hundred hours or whatever it is I have in these games at this point. Of course, these games are going to get easier. If Dark Souls 3 felt even easier than the last game, I'd understand that. After all, I am just getting better and better at these games. The developers can't design the game assuming you have 100 hours into the Souls series already. It only makes sense that the bosses in the early game are going to be a breeze, and by the time you start hitting the end game in the DLC, it'll be a little harder, as that's when the devs can actually take some risk. They already have you hooked. Understanding all of this now very well, I do think Dark Souls 3 is objectively a more difficult game than both Dark Souls 2 and Bloodborne. My basis for this is that I'm better at these games than I've ever been, yet I struggled much more with a few bosses in this game than I had the entirety of the previous 2 games. Let's get into some of the specific Dark Souls 3 bosses, and I'll stop blabbing about game theory or whatever the fuck I'm doing right now. The early game bosses in Dark Souls 3 really weren't hard to me at all. I mostly first and second tried them, including Gundyr, the Tree Gooch Sack Man, that metal fucking piggy. Any MapleStory players out there? Now that I'm thinking about it, I didn't really find any difficulty with the mid-game bosses either, but after that is when this game really started messing my shit up. The mid-game bosses had some super cool themes though. I might have first tried the Abyss Watchers, but it was still a really sick fight thematically. I didn't really struggle until I got to the trio of Dragon Slayer Armor, Pontiff, and Aldrich. Because I didn't really follow any guides, I may have done some of this out of optimal order, but damn did I struggle on some of these guys. Each of these bosses I'd say took me like 10 to 20 tries, and it's been like a few games since anything took me 20 tries to beat. So I was pleasantly surprised with that, honestly. There were some easier, for me at least, late game bosses. I didn't particularly struggle with the Dancer, Lothric, Osirios, or Second Gundyr. One fight I really want to talk about though is the Ancient Wyvern fight. First things first, okay? I'm a little Do you know how many times I fought this wyvern with both my katana and my scythe out trying to hit the weak points on this boss only for it to fly up in the air and nearly one-shot me? Hours and hours and hours and hours I wasted doing this until I was like, maybe I'll just run by the boss and see if there's some sort of gimmick on the other side. And of course, there was, and I don't know why it took me hours to think of that. Like, since when does a boss arena have a route you can go in? Why wouldn't I think of that, dude? Oh man, I'm not sure why, but like because I kept getting the wyvern down to like 20% of its health before eventually running out of Estus, I genuinely thought I could just beat him up and that's what I was supposed to do, and I'm sure I eventually could have done it, but Jesus Christ. I wish that they just had me do literally 0 damage to him so my brain turned on a little quicker and just had me go do the gimmick. Once I finally slain the wyvern and finished exploring the sick area that was Archdragon Peak, I was so fucking hyped to finally fight against the Nameless King. A friend of mine had told me to make sure not to skip this area because it was optional and he was very fond of this boss fight. I thought my boy's memory was just absolutely cooked to a fucking crisp because I was absolutely seething at the first stage of the Nameless King boss fight. After hours of bashing my head into the wyvern fight, I simply could not believe that there was another dragon that I just couldn't reach or couldn't beat up his feet because the moveset would basically one-shot you. I was so infuriated. I was messaging my friend. I was like, dude, this boss fight is ass. I don't know how you could like it, and you're so stupid. The few times I'd actually managed to luck my way through the dragon fight and get to the second phase, I'd actually have great success versus the Nameless King. I'd say my strong suit in these games at this point is just being able to reactionally roll out of the way of attacks and not getting too greedy with my own attacks. And Nameless King's second phase plays very well to that. Too bad I could never get to the second phase without more than one frickin' Estus left or whatever. Until I could, I just kept fighting the boss, and eventually I learned that if I just stayed in front of the dragon or near its head rather than around its feet, he'd have a few attack animations that would leave his head exposed if you could correctly dodge. It was a freaking journey figuring that fight out, but by the end of it, I truly understand why my friend told me it was such a great boss fight. This was the first fight in Dark Souls 3 that really took me back to that Dark Souls 1 feeling of being like, man, it's insane to me that literally anyone can beat this boss. And then you go from, how does anyone do this, to finally, slowly but surely figuring it out and understanding it, and man, I just love that feeling. So yeah, the boss fight isn't ass, it's actually quite good, and my friend isn't even that stupid. In Dark Souls 2, the bosses were notoriously easy, but some of the areas between bosses were quite hard. In a Souls game, the environments they put you in can really be harder than the bosses themselves. Okay, what the fuck? Outside of the previously mentioned Giraffe Dookie Tier Farron's Keep and other various poison swamp areas of the games, the areas didn't particularly feel hard to me in this game. I did get lost a few times or not know how to progress, which felt like hasn't really happened to me since Dark Souls 1. The other games were a little more linear and I think it made it more obvious. I straight up just missed some turns sometimes in this game, and I'd find areas by researching bosses that I'd miss so that I wouldn't miss any. Like, for example, the long bridge that you break to kill all the skeletons on the way to Wolnir. How in the actual fuck am I supposed to know to climb down the bridge that I chopped? It didn't even occur to me. There was another area that I can think of. It's in Ethereal Boreal Valley, or however the hell you say it, where there's one way you can walk into the sewer that reconnects you back to the bonfire, but I didn't even realize you can walk past the sewer to progress to the boss area, and I completely missed that. I got stuck here for a while. One thing that I do think made this game much easier, especially the exploration side of things, is how much Estus you get and just how OP the Estus is in general in this game. This doesn't help you as much in boss fights, because you can still get hit once or twice and stacked out for all your health and die with a full thing of Estus. But in between bonfires, I feel like it's way easier to get your heals off against the smaller mobs, and because you have like frickin' 14 Estus flasks or something crazy in this game, getting to the next bonfire was never really a challenge for me. There is one more dragon boss that I want to talk about, but it's in the DLC, so we're going to talk about the DLC as a whole next, and then of course I want to talk about the final boss of the game. Let's talk about the first DLC that released, the Painted World of Ariandel, as that's the first one that released, and it's the first one that I played. I actually went into the DLC assuming that when that asshole sucked me into his genie lamp or whatever that was part of the base game, and it was the next way for me to progress. It was taking me like 7 hits to kill a single wolf. It was a mess. Once I got into the first DLC when I was actually supposed to and began exploring, I was now killing the wolves in like 2 hits, you know, as God intended. I have to say though, I was thoroughly disappointed with the first DLC's exploration. For one, I still have some snow area PTSD from the frozen tundra or whatever the hell that area is in Dark Souls 2. And 2, the stupid long bridge that you walk through near Sister Fried's bonfire tricked me again. It took me an embarrassingly long time to figure out I was supposed to break that bridge and go down. I thought they released a DLC with no fucking bosses in it. And after I did figure that out, and I know it's embarrassing because I already got tricked by one long bridge in this game, after I figured it out and I was on my way down to the first boss, I was also really not impressed. I beat the first boss in the DLC in 2 tries, and usually the DLC bosses are much harder than the main game. And then I got my wish. My fucking death wish. While I didn't struggle too badly with the base game bosses, the DLC bosses really creamed me good. Sister Fried is the hardest boss I've ever faced in a Souls game, ever. Now, I'm basing this off of the total number of hours that I have in Souls games to this point, as well as the total number of hours it took me to actually kill Fried. there's some mathematic equation here that you can do that would say definitely what I've struggled the most on. It took me about 6 hours of attempting to kill this bitch, and I could not get it done. I wish I had a face camera on, dude, when I saw that third phase for the first time. It took me so long to even beat the first 2 phases. I could not believe that there was a third phase to this boss. Before you call me a noob, I bet that there's a lot of people out there who don't think Sister Fried is that hard, because when I look up the hardest bosses lists of Dark Souls 3, I don't ever see Fried on top, ever. So this is more of a personal issue, I guess. One thing that really screwed me up for this fight is for a long time, I wasn't really able to exploit one of Fried's biggest weaknesses, and that's being that she staggers super easily. Like I said, I had been using the Uchi Katana at this point for most things, and I was really happy with it and its moveset and damage and everything. It didn't occur to me that literally every other weapon in the game would stagger the shit out of Fried, but eventually I was getting really close with the Katana, so I just kept trying. Ultimately, I ended up trying out the Scythe on a whim, and it turned out the Great Scythe literally staggers Fried on every single hit, making the first and third phase of the fight much easier. I'm sure this was a lot of my problem and why this boss took me like 6 freaking hours. It's not like I first tried her after I switched to the Scythe either, it just started becoming a lot easier and I could actually get to that third phase and eventually I got it done, maybe like 45 minutes after I switched to the Scythe. This is my favorite boss fight to date because I had to learn like 4 different movesets, adjust my own loadout constantly, try different defensive items, different rings. I mean, I threw a lot of shit at the wall on this one. I gotta say, the Fried fight really salvaged this first DLC for me because otherwise I really just didn't enjoy it too much. I do know at the time they released some like PvP arena mode or some shit with this DLC, and obviously I'm not benefiting from that at all right now, so I'll cut them a little slack on it. The second DLC, The Ring City, also gets mixed reviews for me for a very similar reason to the first DLC. The first area you drop into, the Dreg Heap, is a poison swamp of a mess, so you know how I feel about that. There's also these stupid angels that blast the shit out of you like you're wearing the wrong color in the wrong neighborhood, and frankly, I guess I was. In general, in these games, I do not enjoy gimmicks. I don't enjoy gimmick bosses or gimmick areas. I count the angels as a gimmick. They want you to run through poison swamps, fight enemies and whatever, all while dodging cover from these stupid Modern Warfare 2 4-kill streak sentry guns, just so you can find where they're camping out and kill them. At least they don't respawn though. After you do get through this mess, you get to the first boss of the second DLC, the Demon Dogs or Demon Bros or Demon Ape Guy or whatever. This boss fight is really cool. You basically have to pay attention to 2 different giant beast movesets and look for the rare opportunity they actually give you to get some hits in on one of them. Then, once you think you've finally beating them because it's a difficult-ass fight, they revive and start going fiery ape shit all over your ass. Overall, great boss fight. Took me like 20 tries and I thoroughly enjoyed them all. After you beat this boss, you finally get to venture into the Ring City itself. Remember the angels that don't respawn? They're back, except they're not angels, they're summoners, and they do respawn, and they're big and giant and ugly and annoying, and they shouldn't respawn. I could not believe it the first time the big man respawned. From that point on, I understood that I was just going to ignore all the summoners and run through the area. The next bonfire you get to in the DLC has a shortcut that you can see, but holy shit, dude. Getting to that shortcut might be the hardest part of the entire game. This was easily my least favorite run I had to do. I'd much rather do the Dark Souls 2 run through Heidi's Tower of Flame. Between the annoying curse guys, the prayer bug Beyblades, the knights, the literally 6 fucking giants on the bridge, the lightning spear guys, this area is hell. They should just rename it hell. It's hell. The giants on the bridge and the summoners needed to not respawn, in my take on how to make the DLC's exploration a little more enjoyable, but honestly, I think sometimes FromSoft just doesn't want it to be enjoyable. I did enjoy the questline with the guy who's trying to rediscover his memory by getting to the altar or whatever it is, and then you find the altar and tell him about it. Until I understood what was actually going on. Patches? Again? God damn you, Patches! I swear to God, as soon as I spawn into Dark Souls 4, I'm going to murder every NPC that I see. The Firekeeper, everybody. You did this to me, Patches. You did this. Alright, let's talk about the final 3 bosses of the DLC before I throw a bow on this sumbitch. The next boss I did was the optional dragon boss of the area, Midir. Midir, in my opinion, is the best dragon fight they've ever made in the Dark Souls series to this point. I really usually enjoy the fights where you're going against like a knight or a humanoid type thing as opposed to a beast or a dragon. Midir is definitely the exception to that. This boss fight was so sick. Unlike the Ancient Wyvern and the first phase of the Nameless King, this boss's moveset basically shows you the openings on when the head is hittable. Weirdly, it feels like I'm saying I want this game on training wheels right now, but like, I feel like the bosses should be hittable with any type of weapon, like even a rapier or whatever. This boss fight was hard as hell too. Some of the attacks were damn near instant kills. You really needed to learn the dodge timings for the moveset. They were slow, they were fast, whereas I feel like other dragon fights in the series are just way more gimmickly. Just run away when he flies up in the air, take one hit their feet, dodge out of the way of feet attacks. This was the best one, and it's not even close. I just briefly wanted to mention mid-ear because it's rare that I actually enjoy a dragon fight in these games. So, yeah. I will say the next boss fight, being the Spear of the Church or whatever, was very mid. I basically just rushed down the summoner and then spam backstabs on the two humanoids. It was disgustingly easy to beat. After you beat them, you unlock the final boss of the DLC, and for many, the final boss of Dark Souls 3. Slave Knight Gale is my second favorite fight in this entire game, and maybe the entire series now after Freed. This boss progresses so well. The first time you go against him in his first form, you might think it's going to be an easy fight, but even getting hit once in his first form will really make you realize you need to be dodging perfectly. Everything ramps up super hard once he hits the second form though. After the cutscene, his 1 and 2 hit combos become like 3 and 4 hit combos. They're way faster, and that can be tough to adjust to after learning the slower, more patient roll timings from the first phase. In the third phase, dude, forget about it. Now we're dodging 5 and 6 hit combos while projectiles are flying. It's basically spamming your roll for your life and praying that he does an attack that actually has a small opening after it. Just identifying the openings are hard as hell in that second and third phase. This fight probably also took me like 3 hours or so, but I loved every minute of it. I knew that this was going to be the last challenge that Dark Souls 3 was going to offer me, so I just basked in every moment of it because once I finally beat it, I knew there was only one job left to do, and that was to defeat the Soul of Cinder. All in all, the DLC of Dark Souls 3, for the first time in the entire series, I think, might have been worse than the base game overall, but it gave me my 2 favorite boss fights ever, so for that, I respect it. Usually these DLCs exploration is just peak. Like the Dark Souls 2 DLC exploration is amazing, but I gotta say that these two just weren't great for exploration. Alright, let's talk about the Lord of Cinder and actually wrap this novel of a video up. When I finished Bloodborne, I knew going into the final boss fight that I was gonna breeze through it. The game hadn't really challenged me to that point. I had just beat the entire DLC, which is always harder than the base game. But I feel like players in 2016 when this game came out and the developers are expecting you to have your like climax, like one of your hardest hitting moments of the game right there in that Lord of Cinder fight. So I try to just go in with the right mindset. Unfortunately for myself and everyone else who does the DLC first, man, it's really tough to hype yourself up after struggling so hard on those DLC bosses because, as expected, the Lord of Cinder was a lot easier than them. I'd gained 1.5 billion souls from the DLC, and yeah, I was just strong as hell, I ain't gonna lie. The final boss of the game did take me a few tries. I didn't first try it or anything, but it didn't really matter to me, man. Thematically, the boss fight was still awesome. The music, the walk to that final arena, getting to that final bonfire, it all just felt so warm and comforting, knowing that I was about to put a bow on this amazing game that had undoubtedly become a favorite of mine over the last 60 or so hours that I had put into it. After defeating the Lord of Cinder, I was wary of my choices, as the last 2 games left me with a choice, but I have to ask, did I miss something? I thought, once again, I would be left with the option, do I want to light the final bonfire, or do I want to walk away from it all? After exploring around though, I did only find the bonfire, and ultimately I lit it, and the credits rolled. I really loved this game, guys. I'll just go ahead and say it now. This is my first ever 10 out of 10 I'm giving on the channel. Dark Souls 3, 10 out of 10. Loved it. I used to say that the game Horizon Zero Dawn was my favorite single-player game, at least for the last 6 years or so, but today, that's changing. I loved Horizon Zero Dawn because it was the first like open world that I fully completed, and I truly loved that game. Everything about it is fantastic. The combat, the exploration, the world. If you haven't played it, I strongly suggest at least trying it. Dark Souls 3 is now my favorite single-player game I have ever played. I love it so much that I think I'm gonna go get a bonfire tattoo to add to all my other shitty ones I got here. I also want to get a pristine copy of Dark Souls 3 to collect too. I got this copy of Dark Souls 3 from the same friend who gave me his copy of Bloodborne, which was a greatest hits copy, and I don't like that. But the real abomination, dude, the real abomination is this Dark Souls 3 case. It might look all fine and dandy at first glance, right? But what is this? See that? Edition Integrale Succumbus Ox Henribus. Sorry, it's really hard to read backwards. My point is what the fuck? How did my friend get a French copy of this game, and why did he give me a French copy of this game? Now I gotta go buy another case, dude. Damn it. Alright guys, this is a really long one. I had to get a chair. I'm tired. I've been recording for like 2 hours. If you did watch this far, I'm sure you're about to hear me out, so I'm gonna do something a little different here. Just bear with me. First of all, I've had channel memberships open on my channel for a long time, and the tier 2 members actually get their username shouted out in the end of every video. The problem is I've never had a tier 2 member until right now. So shout out to you, Davilex. That's his name, right there. Appreciate you, homie. In the future, if you want to have your name mentioned at the end of the video, you can also join the channel below for a few bucks. And if you don't want to throw me a few bucks, that's alright, man. I just appreciate that you watched me for however long this video was. And yeah, if you don't want to throw $2 on your boy, I don't care. You can just comment down below, chat it up with me, hit the like button, all that stuff helps. So yeah, much appreciated. Alright guys, I'm exhausted. I'm going to check out of here. I know this wasn't the best intro in the world, but I can't think straight anymore. So that's all I got. Peace out.